3 years ago, he vanished without a trace, and tonight he was standing in the snow. The thought struck Ethan Walker like a bolt of lightning as his pickup truck crawled through the heart of a Montana blizzard. Snow hammered the windshield so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. The road ahead appeared and disappeared beneath waves of white. Pine trees bent under the weight of the storm. Wind screamed across the mountains like something alive. Ethan tightened both hands around the steering wheel. At 47 years old, the former Navy SEAL had survived deployments, deserts, oceans, and enough hardship to fill several lifetimes. Yet something about this storm felt different. Colder, stranger, lonelier. The cabin waiting for him sat another 10 miles up the mountain. A small place hidden among the pines where he had spent the last few years learning how to live with silence. Then he saw movement. At first he thought it was another shadow created by the swirling snow, a trick of the storm. But the shape appeared again. Large, four-legged, standing directly in the middle of the road. Ethan immediately pressed the brakes. The truck slowed as tires struggled for grip on the icy surface. Headlights cut through the snow. The figure remained perfectly still. Ethan leaned forward. His heartbeat suddenly accelerated. No, it could not be. The dog stood illuminated by the headlights. Black and tan fur, tall ears, strong shoulders. The exact shape Ethan knew better than his own reflection. For several seconds he simply stared. The storm vanished. The world vanished. There was only the dog. Shadow. Ethan opened the truck door. Freezing wind exploded into the cab. Snow instantly covered his jacket. The dog remained motionless. Ethan stepped into the storm. His boots sank into deep snow. Every breath emerged as white vapor. Shadow, he whispered. The name disappeared into the wind. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly. Ethan's chest tightened. 3 years earlier, Shadow had disappeared during a winter search operation in the mountains. Hundreds of volunteers had helped search. Rangers joined. Drones flew overhead. Nothing was ever found. No tracks. No collar. No sign. Eventually, everyone accepted what Ethan never could. Shadow was gone. Yet here he stood, alive, watching him. Ethan took another step. The dog did not run, did not bark, did not move. Snow collected across his back. His amber eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Familiar eyes. Impossible eyes. Ethan felt memories flooding back. Long training exercises. Mountain trails. Campfires. Quiet mornings beside the lake. Years of loyalty packed into a single glance. His throat tightened. Buddy. The German shepherd finally moved. One slow step forward. Then another. Ethan noticed something strange immediately. Shadow looked healthy. Older perhaps. A little more gray around the muzzle. But healthy. Not like a dog lost in the wilderness for years. The observation sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Where had he been? Who had cared for him? How had he survived? The questions came all at once. But before Ethan could reach him, Shadow turned away. The dog looked toward the forest lining the road. Then back at Ethan. Then toward the trees again. Almost as if he wanted Ethan to follow. Ethan frowned. What are you doing? Shadow stepped toward the forest edge. Snow swirled around his legs. Then he stopped and looked back once more. The same look he used during training. The same look that always meant one thing. Come with me. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him this made no sense. A blizzard raged around them. Night had already fallen. Visibility continued worsening. Yet something deeper than logic pulled at him. Something he could not explain. Shadow moved farther into the darkness between the pines. Ethan followed several yards before stopping again. The beam from his flashlight swept across drifting snow. For a moment the dog vanished completely. Then the light found him again, standing beside a massive pine tree, waiting. Ethan pushed forward through knee-deep snow. The wind seemed quieter beneath the trees. The forest absorbed part of the storm's fury. Branches creaked overhead. Frost clung to every surface. When Ethan finally reached the pine tree, Shadow lowered his head toward the ground. Ethan aimed his flashlight downward. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the light reflected off metal beneath the snow. His pulse quickened. Kneeling carefully, he brushed away layers of ice and powder. Slowly, the shape emerged. A small weathered metal box buried at the base of the tree. Ethan stared at it, then looked up, but Shadow was already moving deeper into the forest, disappearing into the storm once again. Snow continued falling through the forest as Ethan stared at the weathered metal box buried beneath the pine tree. For several seconds he forgot about the cold, forgot about the storm, forgot about everything except the impossible chain of events unfolding before him. 3 years of questions suddenly felt closer to an answer. His gloved hands brushed away the remaining snow covering the box. Rust coated its edges. Ice clung to the hinges. Whatever was inside had been hidden here for a very long time. Ethan glanced up. Shadow stood several yards away between the trees. The German shepherd watched him silently. Those familiar amber eyes reflected the beam of the flashlight. Then the dog sat down, calm, patient, waiting. Ethan felt a strange sensation settle over him. It was the same feeling he used to experience during missions when Shadow would locate something important before any human could see it. The dog never acted without reason. Never. Ethan carefully lifted the metal box from the frozen ground. It was heavier than expected. He tried opening it immediately, but the lid would not move. Ice sealed the edges shut. The wind suddenly howled through the forest again. Branches swayed overhead. Snow exploded from the pine needles. Ethan looked toward the dark road hidden somewhere beyond the trees. Staying here any longer would be foolish. The storm was growing worse. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "Let us get home." Shadow immediately stood. Ethan's heartbeat quickened again. The dog still responded exactly as he remembered. Together they pushed through the storm toward the truck. 20 minutes later they reached the cabin. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows as Ethan unlocked the front door. The scent of cedar wood greeted them. A fire soon crackled inside the stone fireplace. Snow melted from Ethan's boots. Steam rose from his jacket. Shadow stepped cautiously into the cabin. Ethan watched every movement. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt unfamiliar. The German shepherd slowly crossed the room and stopped beside the old stone hearth. Then he curled up in the exact same spot where he used to sleep years ago. Ethan froze. He had never shown another dog that location. Never. The sight tightened something deep inside his chest. For a long moment, he simply stood there watching. Then Shadow lifted his head slightly. Around his neck rested a worn leather collar. Ethan knelt beside him. His hands trembled as he examined it. The leather was old, but well cared for. Hanging from the collar was a small metal tag. Ethan turned it over. His breath caught instantly. The engraving remained visible despite years of wear. Shadow. Ethan Walker. If found, please call. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. There was no longer any doubt. This was him. This was truly Shadow. The dog Ethan had searched for across mountains and valleys. The companion he had mourned for 3 long years. Yet one question only grew larger. Where had he been all this time? Before opening the metal box, Ethan prepared food and fresh water. Shadow ate slowly, not like a starving animal, like a dog who had been cared for. Another clue, another mystery. Ethan settled into a chair near the fireplace and placed the box on the coffee table. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the storm continued raging against the windows. Inside, everything felt strangely peaceful. Using a small tool from the kitchen, he carefully broke away the ice sealing the lid. The metal finally creaked open. Inside rested several items wrapped in cloth. Ethan unfolded the first bundle. A photograph. He stared at it. A younger Shadow sat beside an elderly man Ethan had never seen before. Both appeared happy. Snow-covered mountains rose behind them. Ethan slowly turned the photograph over. A handwritten date covered the back. The date had been written only 6 months earlier. Ethan's pulse accelerated. Shadow had been alive. Close enough for someone to take this photograph. Close enough for someone to care for him. He reached for another item. A folded letter. Before opening it, Ethan looked toward Shadow. The German shepherd had not moved. He simply watched from beside the fire, as if he already knew what Ethan was about to discover. And if you are enjoying this journey so far, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Ethan carefully unfolded the letter. The paper crackled in the firelight. Across the top, written in fading blue ink, were 6 words that immediately sent a chill through him. If Shadow finds you, read this. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire and the distant howl of wind outside. Ethan sat motionless in his chair, staring at the first line of the letter. If Shadow finds you, read this. The words felt strangely personal, almost as if the writer had known exactly who would eventually open the envelope. Ethan glanced toward the German shepherd. Shadow remained beside the fireplace. His eyes reflected the orange glow of the flames. Calm, patient, waiting. Ethan unfolded the remaining pages. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and age. The handwriting appeared steady and careful. My name is Walter Hayes. If this letter reaches you, it means Shadow has finally returned home. Ethan slowly leaned back. The name meant nothing to him. Yet the next lines immediately captured his attention. 3 winters ago, during the worst storm I had seen in decades, I found this dog half buried in snow near Blackstone Ridge. He was exhausted, injured, and alone. But even then, he refused to leave a torn piece of fabric clutched beneath his paws. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Blackstone Ridge sat nearly 80 miles from where Shadow disappeared. 80 miles. The distance made no sense. Walter's letter continued. I tried to find his owner. I contacted shelters, rangers, local authorities. Nobody recognized him. The collar was missing when I found him. Whatever happened before that storm, I never learned the full story. Ethan lowered the paper briefly. Outside, snow tapped softly against the cabin windows. The storm seemed weaker now. Yet another storm had begun inside his mind. He looked again at the photograph from the box. Walter appeared to be in his late 70s. Thin, weathered, kind eyes. Beside him sat Shadow. Not frightened, not trapped, comfortable. The image looked less like a rescue and more like a friendship. Ethan returned to the letter. Walter described months spent caring for Shadow inside a small cabin hidden deep in the mountains. He wrote about fishing trips during summer mornings, walks through pine forests, long evenings beside a wood stove. Every page revealed a growing bond between an old man and a dog who seemed to understand every word spoken to him. Then Ethan reached a sentence that made him pause. I always believed Shadow belonged to someone special because every evening he would sit beside the front door and stare toward the mountains, as if he were waiting for someone to come back. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that habit. Shadow used to wait outside Ethan's garage the exact same way whenever he left town. Hours, sometimes entire days. Always watching, always believing. The fire crackled softly. Shadow lifted his head. Ethan continued reading. Walter explained that he lived alone. His wife had passed away years earlier. His daughter had become estranged from him after a painful disagreement nearly a decade before. They had not spoken since. Loneliness filled every paragraph. Yet whenever Walter described Shadow, the tone changed. Hope returned. Warmth returned. The old man sounded alive again. Then Ethan discovered another photograph hidden between the pages. This one showed Walter and Shadow standing beside a frozen lake. Snow covered the mountains behind them. On the back, a handwritten message appeared. Winter number 3. Still waiting. Ethan frowned. Waiting for what? The answer appeared only a few lines later. If you are reading this, then I was right. Shadow never forgot where he belonged. And if he brought you here, then there is something you need to know. Ethan felt a chill move through him. The next section of the letter seemed almost impossible. Walter claimed that Shadow often disappeared into the forest for hours at a time, sometimes entire days. Yet he always returned carrying strange objects. Old photographs, pieces of paper, small personal belongings. At first, Walter assumed the dog had simply discovered forgotten items lost in the wilderness. But over time, a pattern emerged. Every object seemed connected to a single place. A remote cabin deeper in the mountains. A cabin Walter never visited. A cabin Shadow desperately wanted him to find. Ethan looked toward the dog again. Shadow was standing now. The German Shepherd walked toward the front door and stopped. His ears stood upright. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. The exact same look from the forest. Come with me. Ethan slowly folded the letter. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who was Walter really? What cabin had Shadow been leading him toward all these years? Why had the dog returned now after 3 long winters? Then Ethan noticed something else hidden inside the metal box. A folded map. Red ink circled a location deep within the mountains north of Blackstone Ridge. Beside the circle, someone had written 4 simple words. The truth is here. Morning arrived slowly over the mountains. The blizzard had finally weakened, leaving the world buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled beneath pale sunlight. Ethan stood outside the cabin holding the folded map in one hand and Walter's letter in the other. Cold air filled his lungs. Across the clearing, Shadow waited beside the truck. The German Shepherd appeared unusually alert, focused, almost eager. Ethan looked again at the red circle marked on the map. The location sat deep within a remote section of wilderness north of Blackstone Ridge. No roads appeared nearby. No towns. No landmarks. Just mountains and forests stretching across miles of frozen terrain. Whatever waited there had remained hidden for years. Ethan folded the map and climbed into the truck. Shadow immediately jumped into the passenger seat. Within minutes, they were moving north through snow-covered back roads winding between towering pines. The landscape grew increasingly isolated. Cell phone service disappeared. Houses vanished. Civilization slowly faded behind them. The farther they traveled, the stronger Ethan's feeling became that Shadow knew exactly where they were going. Every time the road forked, the dog would lift his head and stare toward the correct direction moments before Ethan reached the turn. By late morning, they arrived at the end of a narrow logging road. Beyond it, nothing but wilderness remained. Ethan parked the truck. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped outside. The forest stood silent around them. Not a single bird called. Not a single branch moved. The entire mountain seemed to be holding its breath. Shadow immediately started forward. Ethan followed. They hiked for nearly an hour through deep snow. The terrain gradually climbed higher into the mountains. Frost covered every pine branch. Sunlight filtered through the trees in pale beams. Then Shadow suddenly stopped. Ethan nearly walked into him. Ahead, partially hidden among the forest, stood a cabin. Ethan stared. The structure looked abandoned. Snow covered the roof. Ice clung to the windows. Years of weather had darkened the wood. Yet despite its condition, something felt strangely preserved about the place. As though time had slowed here. Shadow moved toward the cabin. His pace became slower, more deliberate. Ethan followed carefully. The front door stood slightly open. Wind gently moved it back and forth. The old hinges creaked softly. Ethan stepped inside. The scent of aged wood immediately filled the air. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight entering broken windows. Every object seemed frozen in place. A table, a bookshelf, a wood stove, blankets folded neatly across a chair. It looked less like an abandoned building and more like someone had simply stepped outside and never returned. Shadow walked directly toward a far corner of the room. Ethan noticed several framed photographs hanging on the wall nearby. He approached slowly. His pulse accelerated. Every photograph included Walter, and every photograph included Shadow. Summer afternoons beside a lake. Fishing trips. Forest trails. Campfires beneath starry skies. The years were visible in the sequence of images. Walter grew older. Shadow's muzzle gradually turned gray. But one thing never changed. The bond between them. Ethan studied each photograph carefully. Then he noticed another frame hidden near the end of the collection. Unlike the others, this one showed Walter standing beside a young woman. She appeared to be in her early 30s. Both smiled at the camera. Yet the happiness seemed fragile somehow. The frame contained a handwritten note beneath the image. My daughter, Emily. The name immediately caught Ethan's attention. He remembered Walter mentioning an estranged daughter in his letter. He continued exploring the cabin. On a nearby desk rested several journals stacked neatly beside an oil lamp. Dust covered most of the surface except for one journal resting on top. It looked recently handled. Ethan opened it carefully. The first pages described ordinary life in the mountains. Weather reports, fishing notes, reflections on aging. Then the entries became increasingly personal. Walter wrote about regret, about mistakes, about losing contact with Emily years earlier. Every page carried the same theme. Hope. He never stopped hoping to see her again. Ethan turned another page. Then another. Suddenly, a folded photograph slipped from between the journal pages and landed on the floor. Ethan picked it up. His breath caught instantly. The image showed Shadow standing beside a young woman. Emily. The date on the back had been written only 8 months earlier. Ethan stared at the photograph. If Emily had been here only 8 months ago, then everything Walter wrote about their separation might no longer be true. And beneath the photograph, written in fading ink, were 5 words that immediately changed everything. She finally found us here. The photograph remained in Ethan's hand long after he discovered the message written on the back. She finally found us here. The words echoed through the silent cabin like a distant voice carried by the wind. Outside, sunlight reflected off endless fields of snow. Inside, the air felt heavy with memories. Ethan carefully placed the photograph on the desk and returned to Walter's journal. Shadow lay quietly beside the wood stove, watching him. The old German shepherd seemed calmer than ever, as though every step of this journey was unfolding exactly as it was supposed to. Ethan opened the journal to the entry following the photograph. The handwriting appeared steadier than before, almost joyful. October 14th. Today my daughter walked through that door. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He continued reading. Walter described hearing footsteps outside the cabin shortly before sunset. He expected to find a neighbor or a lost hiker. Instead, he opened the door and saw Emily standing beneath the pines. Neither spoke for several seconds. Years of separation hung between them. Then Shadow ran past Walter and placed himself directly between father and daughter. According to the journal, the German shepherd wagged his tail so hard that both of them laughed through their tears. Ethan smiled softly despite the sadness woven through the story. The next several entries described a reunion that Walter had nearly given up hoping for. Emily stayed at the cabin for weeks. They talked beside the fireplace, walked along frozen trails, shared old photographs, repaired years of misunderstandings one conversation at a time. Walter wrote about forgiveness, about second chances, about how easily pride can steal precious years from people who love each other. Every page revealed a man rediscovering hope late in life. Ethan turned another page, then another. The journal continued through winter. Walter's handwriting gradually became less steady. Certain words appeared shakier than before. A different truth slowly emerged. Walter was sick, very sick. He never described the illness directly, yet the clues filled every paragraph. Short walks becoming difficult, long periods of rest, increasing exhaustion. Emily offered to move him closer to town where doctors could help. Walter refused. He loved the cabin, loved the mountains, loved waking each morning beside the lake and the dog who had changed his life. Ethan understood that feeling. Some places become part of a person's soul. Leaving them feels impossible. Shadow lifted his head as Ethan reached a later entry. Snow had begun falling again outside the windows. Small flakes drifted gently through the afternoon sunlight. Walter's words grew increasingly emotional. If not for this dog, I would have spent my final years alone. Ethan paused. The sentence carried enormous weight. Walter described the winter storm when he first discovered Shadow. He had been gathering firewood near Blackstone Ridge when he noticed movement beneath a snowbank. Most people would have walked past without seeing anything. Walter nearly did, but something made him stop. What he found was a nearly frozen German shepherd refusing to abandon a torn piece of fabric trapped beneath his paws. Walter never learned where the fabric came from. He only knew the dog would not leave it behind, even after being rescued, even after recovering. Shadow kept it for months. Ethan's pulse quickened. He remembered the torn training jacket Shadow had been wearing the day he disappeared. Could that have been the fabric Walter described? The possibility sent another wave of emotion through him. Walter's journal continued. He wrote about the extraordinary loyalty he witnessed over the following years. Shadow seemed driven by a purpose Walter could never fully understand. Certain dates always changed the dog's behavior. Certain locations always drew his attention. Sometimes he would disappear into the mountains and return carrying old objects. Sometimes he would sit outside staring toward distant ridges for hours. Walter believed Shadow was following memories, following promises. Then Ethan reached the final completed entry. The handwriting trembled noticeably. Emily visited today. Shadow stayed close to her all afternoon. I think he understands something that I do not. The sentence ended there. No explanation followed. No additional pages had been written. Ethan slowly closed the journal. Silence settled over the room. The story was becoming clearer, yet one enormous piece remained missing. What happened after Walter stopped writing? Ethan looked around the cabin. Sunlight had shifted across the floor. Long shadows stretched between the furniture. Then he noticed something hidden beneath the desk. A small wooden box. Unlike everything else in the cabin, it appeared carefully protected. Ethan pulled it into the light. A brass latch secured the lid. Beside it rested a folded envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. The name written across the front instantly stopped his breath. To Ethan Walker. Shadow had not merely led him to Walter. Somehow, years before they ever met, someone here had been expecting him. The cabin seemed smaller after Ethan saw his own name written across the envelope. For several moments, he simply stared at it. Snow drifted quietly past the windows. The late afternoon sun cast long golden beams through the room. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, wind moved gently through the pine trees. Yet inside, everything felt suspended in time. Ethan carefully picked up the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but it remained perfectly preserved. His name appeared in steady handwriting. To Ethan Walker. Not to the owner of Shadow. Not to whoever might find this place. Specifically to him. A man Walter had never met. A man who lived nearly 100 miles away. Ethan felt a strange pressure in his chest. Slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside rested a folded letter. Shadow rose from beside the stove and quietly walked over. The German Shepherd sat beside Ethan's chair, watching, almost as if he already knew every word written inside. Ethan unfolded the pages. The first sentence immediately made him stop breathing for a second. Ethan, if you are reading this, then Shadow succeeded. The room seemed to fall silent. Walter continued, we never met, but I have known about you for years. Shadow told me. Ethan almost laughed at the impossible statement. Yet as he continued reading, the meaning became clear. Walter explained that during the years they spent together, Shadow never stopped revealing pieces of his previous life. Not through words, but through habits, routines, and memories. The dog would respond to military commands. He would sit beside the radio whenever news about veterans played. He would return repeatedly to the same ridgeline overlooking the valley, as if searching for someone. Walter wrote that he eventually realized the dog belonged to a soldier. A good one. A man worth finding again. Ethan swallowed hard. Walter described how he spent years gathering clues. Old tags. Fragments of equipment. Local reports from the winter Shadow disappeared. Piece by piece, he learned Ethan's identity. Then came the sentence that changed everything. I never tried to take him from you. I only borrowed the years that remained. Ethan lowered the letter. His eyes moved toward Shadow. The old German Shepherd looked back calmly. No guilt. No confusion. Only trust. Ethan continued reading. Walter admitted that he had often encouraged Shadow to return home. Sometimes he even drove to nearby towns hoping the dog would pick up a familiar scent. But every time, Shadow returned to the cabin. Not because he forgot Ethan. Because Walter needed him. The realization settled heavily over Ethan. For 3 years he had carried quiet pain. Questions without answers. Part of him had wondered whether Shadow had chosen another life. Another owner. Another home. Yet Walter's words painted an entirely different picture. Shadow had stayed because someone lonely needed him. Someone grieving needed him. Someone facing the final chapter of life needed a friend. Tears gathered in Ethan's eyes. He blinked them away and kept reading. Walter described the final months of his illness. His strength faded. Simple tasks became difficult. Yet Shadow remained beside him every day. During storms. During long nights. During moments when fear felt larger than hope. The dog never left. Then the letter reached its most personal section. One evening, not long before winter returned, Walter finally asked himself a question. What would happen to Shadow when he was gone? The answer haunted him. Emily lived several states away. Her work kept her constantly traveling. She loved the dog, but she could not give him the life he deserved. Walter knew there was only one place Shadow truly belonged. Home. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he read the next paragraph. I believe dogs understand promises better than people do. Shadow understood mine. Walter explained that shortly before his death, he showed Shadow old photographs and maps. He spoke Ethan's name often. He pointed toward the mountains where their paths first crossed. Somehow, in ways no one could fully explain, the dog seemed to understand. Walter believed Shadow would find his way back when the time came. Ethan stared at the final page. The handwriting had become noticeably weaker. If Shadow brought you here, there is one thing left unfinished. Emily deserves to know what happened after I was gone. She deserves the truth. The sentence ended with a simple address written beneath it. A small town in Idaho. Ethan looked at the address for several seconds. Then he noticed something tucked behind the final page. A recent photograph. Walter sat on the cabin porch, smiling weakly at the camera. Beside him stood Emily. Between them sat Shadow. All three looked peaceful. Happy. Whole. On the back of the photograph, written in fading blue ink, were 7 words that sent another chill through Ethan's heart. She never knew about the last letter. The photograph remained on the desk long after Ethan finished reading the words on the back. She never knew about the last letter. Outside, evening slowly settled across the mountains. The sky beyond the cabin windows glowed with fading shades of blue and silver. Snow reflected the last traces of daylight. Inside, the silence felt sacred. Ethan carefully placed the photograph beside Walter's journal and looked toward Shadow. The old German shepherd was already standing near the door again. Waiting. Ethan almost smiled. It seemed the dog had spent years carrying unfinished pieces of someone else's story, and now he was determined to see the final chapter completed. Ethan folded Walter's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he opened the wooden box resting beneath the desk. Inside were several neatly organized documents tied together with a faded blue ribbon. There were photographs, handwritten notes, and a sealed envelope bearing Emily's name. Ethan immediately understood. This was the final letter Walter had mentioned, the one she had never received. His chest tightened. Walter had trusted Shadow to deliver the truth. Somehow, impossibly, the dog had carried that responsibility across years, storms, and mountains. Ethan gently picked up the envelope. Emily Hayes. The handwriting was unmistakably Walter's. Careful, personal, loving. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he returned everything to the wooden box except the envelope and one folded sheet of paper tucked beneath it. The paper contained an address in Idaho along with a short note. If circumstances do not allow me to give her this myself, perhaps someone kinder than fate will finish what I could not. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had spent years wondering why Shadow disappeared, why he never came home, why fate had taken away his closest companion without explanation. Now the answer was standing only a few feet away. Shadow had never abandoned him. The dog had simply answered another call. Another person needed him. Another lonely soul needed a friend. The realization broke something open inside Ethan. Not pain, not anger, understanding. The fire crackled softly behind him. Snow drifted past the windows. For the first time in 3 years, the questions that haunted him were beginning to fade. He packed the letters and photographs into a weatherproof bag. Night was approaching quickly, and the roads would become difficult again. Yet he knew exactly what came next. The address waited in his pocket. The final letter waited beside it. And somewhere in Idaho, a daughter still did not know the entire truth about her father. Ethan stepped outside with Shadow following close behind. The air felt colder now. Stars appeared one by one above the dark silhouettes of pine-covered mountains. He locked the cabin door carefully. Not because anyone would come here, but because it felt respectful. Walter's home deserved that much. Before leaving, Ethan looked back one final time. Warm light from the setting sun still touched the cabin roof. Snow sparkled around it. For a brief moment, he imagined Walter standing on the porch beside Shadow, watching the valley below. The image lingered in his mind long after he turned away. The drive south took several hours. Darkness covered the mountains completely. Headlights carved narrow tunnels through the night. Shadow rested quietly in the passenger seat. Occasionally, he lifted his head and glanced toward Ethan. Every time, Ethan felt the same strange certainty. The dog knew where they were going. Near midnight, they reached Ethan's cabin. Exhaustion settled into his bones. Yet sleep never came. He sat beside the fireplace reviewing the letters once more. Certain details stood out now. Dates, names, references to places. Most importantly, repeated mentions of Emily's regret about losing contact with her father for so many years. Walter never blamed her. Not once. Even in his final writings, he spoke only of hope. Hope that she would find happiness. Hope that she would forgive herself. Hope that one day she would understand how deeply she was loved. Ethan stared into the flames. He had seen many forms of courage during his years in uniform. But there was something uniquely brave about a person choosing forgiveness when time was running out. The clock on the wall crept past midnight. Then 1 in the morning. Eventually Ethan stood and walked to the window. Moonlight covered the snowy landscape outside. Shadow joined him. Together they looked out across the silent clearing. Ethan rested a hand on the German shepherd's shoulder. "We are going to finish this," he said quietly. Shadow's ears lifted slightly. Nothing more. No bark. No movement. Yet somehow the response felt clear. The journey was not over. The truth hidden inside the mountains had finally been found. Now it needed to reach the person it was always meant for. And waiting inside the final envelope was a message neither Ethan nor Shadow had seen. A message that would change everything once it was finally opened. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Ethan loaded the truck before sunrise. Frost covered the windshield. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and snow. Shadow stood beside the passenger door, watching quietly as if he understood the importance of the day ahead. The envelope addressed to Emily rested safely inside Ethan's jacket. Walter's final words remained close to his heart. By 7 o'clock, they were already heading west. Mile after mile of snow-covered highway stretched before them. Mountains slowly gave way to rolling farmland. Small towns appeared and disappeared beyond the windows. Throughout the journey, Ethan found himself thinking about promises. Some promises lasted weeks, some lasted years, and some, apparently, could survive storms, distance, and even loss. Shadow spent most of the drive resting with his head against the seat. Occasionally, he lifted his eyes toward Ethan whenever the truck slowed. Each glance seemed to carry the same quiet message. Keep going. By late afternoon, they crossed into Idaho. The address led them toward a modest town nestled beside a frozen river. The community was small. A few brick storefronts lined the main street. Christmas lights still hung from several buildings despite the holidays having passed weeks earlier. Everything felt peaceful, ordinary. Yet Ethan's pulse steadily increased as they approached the final destination. According to Walter's note, Emily worked at a local bookstore near the town square. Ethan parked across the street. For a moment, he remained seated behind the wheel. Through the window, he could see customers moving inside. Warm yellow light glowed behind the glass. Life continued normally in that building. Emily had no idea that two visitors had traveled hundreds of miles carrying a piece of her father's heart. Ethan finally stepped out. Shadow immediately followed. Together, they crossed the street. A small bell chimed as the bookstore door opened. The scent of coffee and paper filled the room. Shelves stretched toward the back wall. Soft music played overhead. Behind the counter stood a woman organizing a stack of books. Ethan recognized her instantly. She looked older than the photograph from the cabin. Yet there was no doubt. The same eyes. The same smile Walter carried in the framed picture. Emily looked up as they entered. Then her attention shifted toward Shadow. Everything changed. The books slipped from her hands and landed softly on the counter. Her expression froze. For several seconds, she simply stared. Shadow walked forward slowly. His tail moved gently. Not excited. Not nervous. Familiar. Emily pressed a hand against her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Shadow, she whispered. The dog stopped directly in front of her. Emily knelt beside him. Her hands trembled as they rested against his neck. The years seemed to disappear from her face. Ethan watched in silence. Some reunions did not need words. Some emotions were too large for conversation. Emily buried her face against Shadow's fur. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The German shepherd remained perfectly still. Patient. Loyal. Present. When she finally looked up, her eyes found Ethan. Confusion mixed with hope. Where did you find him? She asked softly. Ethan reached into his jacket. The envelope felt heavier now than it had anywhere along the journey. He carefully placed it on the counter between them. Emily stared at the handwriting. The moment she recognized it, all color drained from her face. Her fingers touched the envelope as though it might vanish. That is my father's writing, she whispered. Ethan nodded. No explanation seemed adequate. Emily lowered herself into a nearby chair. Snow drifted gently outside the bookstore windows. The world beyond continued moving as normal. Yet inside, time appeared to stop. She looked at the envelope, then at Shadow, then back at Ethan. Finally, she asked the question he knew had been waiting for years. What happened to him? Ethan slowly sat across from her. He glanced toward Shadow, who had settled beside Emily's chair. The old dog rested his head against her leg exactly as he once rested beside Walter. The sight nearly broke Ethan's heart. He took a slow breath and prepared to tell her everything. But before he could begin, Emily carefully turned the envelope over. On the back, beneath the seal, Walter had written one final sentence. A sentence neither Ethan nor Shadow had noticed until that very moment. And the moment Emily read it, tears began falling faster than before. The bookstore remained completely silent as Emily stared at the back of the envelope. Snow drifted softly beyond the windows. A customer entered through the front door, glanced around, sensed the emotion hanging in the room, and quietly stepped back outside. Ethan watched as Emily traced her father's handwriting with trembling fingers. Beneath the seal, Walter had written a single sentence. If Shadow brings this to you, then I finally made it home. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks before she even opened the letter. Shadow remained beside her chair with his head resting gently against her leg. The old German shepherd seemed perfectly content, as if the weight he had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. Emily carefully broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded slowly. Her eyes moved across the first lines. Then she covered her mouth and closed her eyes. Ethan looked away for a moment, giving her privacy. The only sounds came from the ticking wall clock and the distant wind outside. Several minutes passed before Emily finally spoke. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "He never stopped loving me." Ethan nodded. He already knew. Every journal entry, every photograph, every letter Walter left behind carried the same message. Love had survived even when time, distance, and regret tried to bury it. Emily continued reading. Sometimes she smiled through tears. Sometimes she paused to gather herself before moving forward. Walter wrote about the day she was born. He wrote about teaching her to ride a bicycle. He wrote about fishing trips, family holidays, and mistakes he wished he could take back. Most importantly, he wrote about forgiveness. He never blamed her for the years they lost. He only hoped she would forgive herself. The final page seemed especially difficult for her to read. When she reached the end, she pressed the letter against her chest and wept quietly. Shadow gently nudged her hand. The gesture was small, familiar, loving. Emily looked down at him and laughed softly through her tears. "You carried this all this way, did you not?" she whispered. The German shepherd blinked slowly. Ethan felt his own eyes grow wet. He had spent 3 years believing Shadow vanished from his life, believing he had somehow lost his closest companion forever. The truth was far more beautiful and far more painful than anything he imagined. Shadow had not disappeared. He had answered another call for help. He had stayed beside a lonely old man until the very end. Then he had carried a promise across mountains and winters to make sure one last message reached the person who needed it most. As evening settled outside, Emily and Ethan talked for hours. He shared everything he discovered in the cabin. The journals, the photographs, the hidden box, the map, Walter's final hopes. Emily listened carefully. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she smiled. Every story brought her father back to life for a few moments. By the time darkness filled the town square, something inside her seemed lighter. Not healed completely. Some losses never heal completely, but lighter. Before closing the bookstore, Emily disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a framed photograph. Ethan recognized it immediately. Walter stood beside Shadow in front of the mountain cabin. Both looked happy, peaceful. Emily handed it to him. "I think he would want you to have this," she said. Ethan accepted it quietly. Outside, snow had stopped falling. The sky above the town shimmered with stars. Ethan loaded his truck while Emily knelt beside Shadow one last time. She wrapped her arms around the old German shepherd and held him close. "Thank you," she whispered. Not to Ethan, not to fate, to Shadow, the dog who refused to forget. The dog who carried loyalty farther than anyone believed possible. The drive home felt different. The mountains no longer seemed lonely. The questions that haunted Ethan for years had finally found answers. Several days later, he returned to the cabin by the lake. Winter sunlight reflected across frozen water. Pine trees stood silent beneath fresh snow. Ethan carried the framed photograph into the house and placed it above the fireplace. Shadow settled into his favorite spot beside the hearth, the same spot he had chosen on the night he came home. For a long time, neither moved. The fire crackled softly. Golden light filled the room. Peace settled over everything. Ethan looked at the old dog resting comfortably nearby. Shadow opened his eyes briefly and met his gaze. No words were needed. The mission was finished. The promise had been delivered. A father found his daughter again. A daughter found her father's love again. And a faithful German shepherd finally found his way home. Outside, snow drifted gently across the mountains. Inside, beside the warm glow of the fire, 2 old friends sat together in quiet understanding. Some storms take things away. Others reveal what was never truly lost.